talk now about soils. We've talked about climate, and I hope you've listened to those lectures and read that section of the chapter. Today this video is talking about soils and goes along with a reading from Gurevich et al. Soils. We're going to be talking about soils, biotic interactions, and a little bit about disturbances. Soils. These are the major soil orders, and soils have classifications just as do biological organisms, and these soil orders are mapped here across North America, from South America on up through Mesoamerica into the US and Canada, and we see just by the color patterns that these soil orders correspond to climate. We see certain colors in the far north, and as we come further and further south and maybe near the coasts or in the plains, we see different colors emerging that are a consequence of climate and the underlying, and to a lesser extent actually, the underlying bedrock. The names of these soil orders sound a little strange to our ears. They have a Russian origin, and so they just sound a little different. Alpha sols, entisols, inceptisols. These are all different kinds of soils that we'll be describing. You'll need to read about these soil types, these soil orders in the reading to understand how they form and to understand the consequences of how they formed, how fertile they are, how infertile they are, and the processes that shaped those different soil types. But at least right off the bat, we can look at this map and see, oh, this has got to be related to climate somehow. And maybe that's a consequence, as will have consequences for the vegetation and for the other organisms living there. Or maybe the vegetation is helping cause these different soil types. Here's another representation of this, and you've seen a diagram like this. I've referred to this as a Whittaker diagram, where we have precipitation on one axis and temperature on the other axis. On the bottom, we have the precipitation axis in this case, where we have low precipitation or dry conditions over on the left, and as we move toward the right, we have increasingly high precipitation. On the vertical or y-axis, we have temperature, but it's ordered from high temperature at the bottom to low temperature at the top. And so up at the top, we have very low temperature and low precipitation, and this is what characterizes the tundra biome. And if we come all the way down that, we see different biomes of temperate grassland and tropical grassland and tropical shrubland of increasingly high temperature but still low precipitation. Of course, at the very lowest precipitation, we have deserts. As we move across from left to right, we go from deserts to grasslands and shrublands to deciduous forest and coniferous forest, and then temperate rainforest. And we have those temperate rainforests over on the northwest coast of North America. And you'll see in each of these biome types, down at the bottom, you'll see labeled the most characteristic soil type of that biome. So for temperate rainforests and actually temperate coniferous forest, slightly drier coniferous forests, because these are both coniferous forests. We all have spotisols in the deciduous forest that's characteristic of Ohio. We have alphasols and the like. And so it's really important for you to associate the names of these soil orders to the different biomes and the different regions around North America, because one really important thing that I strive to emphasize in this course is the connection between climate and soils and vegetation, and how they all actually influence each other. So especially that interplay between how the climate affects both the vegetation and the soils, and how the soils and the vegetation affect each other. There's a lot of reciprocal feedbacks going on between vegetation and soils. When we discuss soils, it's really useful to think about lots of different ways to think about soils, but one that's particularly useful for ecologists is to think about texture, decaying organic matter, the biota that lives in it, the atmosphere that's down in the soil, and the soil solution. And by texture, we mean the different mineral soil components that make up the mineral fraction of the soil. And that's what we're going to start talking about next. Here we have the categories of soils that soil scientists and ecologists use. We refer to these as gravel, coarse sand, fine sand, silt, and clay. And those fractions of sand, silt, and clay are key to understanding soil texture and the characteristics of those soils. If we look to the right, we see just a hypothetical pile of soil particles, and we can imagine down in the soil these particles arrayed and with water and organic matter between all of these mineral particles. If we think of these as sand, these are big, fairly inert particles. Sand, especially, is made of silicon, which is a very inert material, doesn't react with a lot of things, doesn't bind with a lot of soil nutrients that plants use, but it provides key characteristics. Sand in particular, just shown here, allows for a lot of air to be in the soil, allows for water to pour through the soil so that the water doesn't become stagnant. And so sand is really critical for soils to allow a certain amount of air and in the soil and for water to flow through the system. Next to that are really cartoons of what clay is like. Clay, in this case, a type of clay called kaolinite, is so fine. The particles of clay are so fine, they're like leaves of paper, hugely, just microscopically fine layers that are so fine that they interact like molecules with charge on them. And the layers of rock, the layers of clay are so fine. That's what gives clay its sticky quality. Clay has a sticky quality because of actual electrostatic bonds between those particles of clay. Clay is so fine, it acts like a molecule, even though they're separate physical particles. And clay is really, really important for hanging on, helping to hang on to things. So clay is good for the space it provides, for the allowing of air to be in there, for allow water to flow through. Clay is critical because it hangs on to important nutrients that plants need. And without any clay in the soil, all those nutrients just wash away through the sand. That's why sand alone is really, really hard to grow anything in, because there are no nutrients in the sand. They all just immediately wash away. Clay hangs on to those nutrients. And so the sweet spot of soils is to have a mix of sand and clay and particles that are in between these sizes called silt. And so good soils have some mixture of sand, silt, and clay. We can see those when we take a pile of dirt and put it in a jar of water. If you take a pile of dirt, you could do this tonight, this afternoon. Go out and get a handful of dirt and put it in a jar or a glass and swirl it around, mix it up really, really well, shake it around. Jar's better for this because you got a lid. Mix it around, shake it all up, and then let it settle out. And what you'll find is that, of course, the heavier particles, the bigger particles settle out quickly. Then the silt begins to settle out. And then after the silt is settling out, the clay slowly over days begins to settle out. And so you can see these layers form. And soil scientists like our own Melanie Fisk in biology will do these to help measure the different amounts of sand, silt, and clay in different soils. And here are some examples of that somebody did. Of course, they ate a lot of Classico spaghetti sauce, and they did that with soils from 3 different farms, 1, 2, 3. They did it with some potting soil mix, and they did it with the soil sitting outside in their home. And you can see in these farm soils different amounts of sand and silt and clay that is still settling out. All this cloudy water still has clay in it, but you can see the sand settling out and the silt and this cloudy water that still has a lot of clay in it, and it will be settling out in that top layer. This orange, you might ask yourself, where does orange come from? Orange in soils. Orange is rust. It's iron oxide. That's where that orange comes from. And it's quite common in soils in ultisol soils that we have in our southeastern United States, where the soils are very, very poor, and in tropical areas that are very, very iron rich. So those show us the soil texture. Soil texture, excuse me. Need a sip of water here. As I mentioned when we were talking about sand and clay, soil texture is very important for the amount, because it determines the amount of water that can be held in soils. If the particles are too big and too inert, like just pure sand, the water flows straight through. If it's all clay, the clay just hangs on to all of that water. And the balance is really important for the amount of water that's in there. And the amount of water that's in there we refer to in a variety of ways, but the state of that water in soils may be saturated, or at field capacity, or at wilting point. And let's start with, over here on the right, with wilting point. This is the point at which there's so little water in the soils that plants wilt. They don't have enough water, and so they're highly stressed, and they're losing too much water, and they can't get enough, and so they just they lose too much water, and they wilt and become soft and unable to maintain their shape. This happens, you'll notice there's still water in here, and this is because the water is being held onto by the soil particles, typically by electric charges. Water is a highly reactive liquid, solvent, and binds to charged particles, and also through capillary action simply hangs on to the surfaces of things. And if the only water that's left in there is sticking to fine soil particles, then plants don't have enough. It doesn't mean there's no water in the soil. It simply means that it's stuck more firmly to soil particles than is available for plants. As we increase the soil moisture in the soils, we have more water in the soil, but we also still have airspace. And so we need both airspace, because roots are living parts of plants, and roots need air. Soil organisms need air. And so at this point, this is an amount, field capacity is the point at which if you have a pile of soil no water drains out. You'll see that's illustrated here where there's no water literally dripping out. So if you have a handful of dirt and you just set it aside in a funnel and no water comes out, that is at field capacity. A soil is saturated when it's completely full of water and there's no more air in it because all of the air spaces or pore spaces are completely filled with water. Plants can't, well, most plants, most terrestrial plants can't grow in soils like these either because, as I mentioned, they need air. And so soils go from completely saturated to a wilting point where the only water in there is completely bound to soil particles. Here are just examples of terms, sort of the range of soils that we're likely to encounter here. On the bottom here, we've got the composition by dry weight of these things, and the different bar colors refer to the lightest is sand, the middle brown color is silt, and the darkest is clay. So when we say sandy soils, that classification is not completely sand, but it's mostly sand, over 90% sand. And then we have, loam, which is typically what, farmers like. This is sort of optimal growing soils. And you can see that it's almost half sand and only 15% clay. Once you start getting more clay than that, like 45% clay, that becomes too dense for most plants to grow well in. The clay fills up air spaces and fills up spaces for water to exist, and any water that is in the soil is trapped by the clay, and so it's too difficult for plants to grow in. And so some sort of Goldilocks mix in the middle is what plants grow really well in, around 50% silt. So just give you some idea of sort of the ballpark of what we're talking about here, that's all. You don't need to memorize these terms on the right. I just want to give you some sense of the range of these things. And for the really adventurous among you, the next 3 slides provide a soil texture DIY test where you can just start with like a tablespoon of soil in your palm, and you can sort of go through this flow chart and decide what kind of soil you've got, whether it's sand or loamy sand or all of these different characteristics. An experienced soil scientist or agronomist would have a sense for all of these things. So you can do this in your spare time. You don't need to worry about this for an exam, but I know you're just chomping at the bit to go out and do this yourself. Soil biota is another key component of soils. Without microorganisms and invertebrates and even vertebrates in that soil, plants, it would be a very different thing altogether. First of all, bacteria and invertebrates are constantly chewing up dead plant material, this organic material right here. This organic material, the dead plant material, and remember, most plants wind up just dead and falling to the ground and decomposing. And they're first colonized by these fungi and bacteria. That makes this combination, organic matter, bacteria, and fungi, makes that nutritious for animals and protozoa to eat. And so animals start chewing on this mushy mix of fungi and bacteria. And of course, larger arthropods that are predators start to feed on those things. Nematodes, a kind of roundworm, and earthworms are tunneling through this and creating pore spaces through their tunneling activity. Of course, larger animals like this mole or gophers they turn the soil over and they help mix the soil up. They create different soil patches that create the spatial variation, the heterogeneity that allows the variety, helps allow the variety of plants that we see out there. Right. Organisms are critical. We're going to talk a lot more about the special relationship between mycorrhizal fungi and plants actually in the next lecture. So soils develop over time. So I want to talk about soil formation, those processes and things that influence them. And of course, it starts with a physical weathering of rock, right? Rock is prone to physical weathering. Just the water flowing over rock slowly leaches minerals out of rock, and freezing causes the water that gets down into rocks to freeze and break apart rocks. And so there's a lot of physical weathering of rock that goes on. And of course, over longer time scales, as we have plate tectonics shifting continental plates around, that shifts things up. We get earthquakes and volcanoes churning the earth up on slower and larger time scales. There's biotic weathering, and this arises when when fungi especially put out extracellular acids into the soil to force the rock to release more of their nutrients through these acids. It also happens through this chemical weathering happens through the decomposition of plant material and through stuff that comes out of roots. Roots exudates, creates a slightly more acid soil solution, and this helps dissolve the rock. So this physical, chemical, and biological weathering of rock is really, really important. Another important component of soils is the amount of organic matter or dead plant material that's in there. And the amount of organic material is really, really important for you to consider, because this is a place that really helps crystallize and simplify our understanding of how ecosystems function when we compare Panama to Mexico to North Dakota to Alaska. The difference in organic matter in soils is a reflection of how much biomass is being produced in an ecosystem, so how productive is the vegetation, versus how fast it decomposes. And the relative rates of production and decomposition determine the amount of soil organic matter. So just briefly, in the tropics, we have tons of production, so you'd think we'd have a ton of organic matter, but we don't, because in addition to having very rapid production, we also have extremely rapid decomposition. In the far, far north, we have and in deserts, we have very, very low production, and we also have very, very low decomposition. So depending upon the fine balance of those, we may have either a lot of organic matter, if production is just slightly higher than decomposition, or we may have none at all because production is so very, very low. So the balance of these two processes, primary production and decomposition, determine the amount of organic matter we see in the soils. Of course, this is related to precipitation and evaporation, and we've talked about this a little bit. And so the production and decomposition are tied to the relative amounts of evaporation and precipitation that we see in these soils. When there's a lot of precipitation, there's a lot of chemical weathering of rock. When there's a lot of evaporation, that means there's a lot of buildup of minerals in the soil. And of course, all of this happens over time. And so soils that are relatively new haven't had a lot of these processes develop through time. Whereas soils that are very, very old have gone through a sort of a long, millennial-long time of all of these things happening, and it results in different kinds of soils, whether you have inceptisoils that are fairly young, or tropical ultisols or oxasols that are very, very old and highly depleted. So what's a new soil? Well, time matters in this equation, right? 20,000 years ago, we had ice sheets covering a good part of North America. And then as these ice sheets melted over the past, well, from about 20 to 10,000 years ago, these ice sheets melted away and left behind a lot of simple mineral debris. And so these were very, very young soils. And so now these areas of tundra and boreal forest and some of our northern forests have somewhat young soils. They've been developing over time. So all of the mineral nutrients, especially phosphorus that was locked up in just the pure rock, that was highly available when those soils were young, when that ice melted and just all that rock and gravel and sand was left behind. And it's been weathering over the past 20,000 years. In contrast, if we go down to the tropics, we've got soils that are hundreds of thousands of years old, and those have undergone so much weathering that most of the nutrients have washed out. And so in many cases, we have very, very poor soils in tropical regions because those soils are so old. In other cases, when we have soils that are brand new, like at the tops of mountains or in parts of the tundra, when soils are brand new, these are also not so great because they haven't developed over time yet. So here we've got a schematic from your reading of soil development through time. So we've got on the horizontal axis here, we've got time. And on the left side, we've got fresh, unweathered rock. And then over time, we see the process of the development of different kinds of soils. Eventually, ultisols have developed, and over time, we get an accumulation of organic matter. We get this deep zone of leaching, and at the bottom of all, precipitation is coming down from the top, and we have a lot of biological activity at the top. So we've got a lot of action happening, a lot of biological and chemical actioning happening right at the soil surface, accumulating organic matter, creating a lot of nutrients, but also washing things away. And so we have this mix of these kinds of soils. We refer to this as a well-developed, moderately a mature soil. Here we have the same kind of thing going on in grassland soils, but as we'll learn, grassland soils face the problem of a lot of evaporation. Grasslands exist in very warm areas, and so while they may have some moderate amount of precipitation, they're also faced with tremendous evaporation because they can be so hot. And so what happens is you get precipitation, but then you get a lot of evaporation. And so minerals that kind of come out of the rock and actually out of the rain over millennia, those accumulate there. And so we get this buildup of calcium carbonate and calcium sulfate that actually performs sort of an underlying layer of calcium, typically mostly carbonate. So we get rock developing under these grassland soils, especially as you go into somewhat drier soils. In moist grasslands that once were characteristic of our eastern grasslands in Iowa and Illinois, for instance, this organic matter accumulation was phenomenal, and we had organic matter accumulation of 3 to 6 feet and that's what provided the foundation for the first agriculture, some of the first large-scale agriculture in the United States, before, of course, it all blew away in wind erosion and is still getting lost through water erosion and winding up in the Gulf of Mexico. So to take a closer look at these soil profiles that develop, we have characteristically about 5 horizons. The top, the O horizon, is the organic matter horizon. In some cases, that's highly developed. In other cases, it's very, very thin. Um, and here's just a chunk of dirt with, and you can see a top here with a fair amount of organic rich soil, and then the top of the A horizon down here. And this is a mix of a small amount of organic matter. And as you move down these profiles to the B and C horizon and parent material, you have increasingly higher fraction of mineral components and parent material. And of course, this is where you have the biota, and these horizons developing over time. And depending upon the underlying bedrock and the physical processes and the age of the soils, you get the development of these layers that you can see when you cut down through this. Here's a soil pit in which soil ecologists are studying the accumulation of organic matter in these soils and mineral nutrients. And you can see the different layers here, the lighter colored layers with fewer nutrients, and the upper layers with more. And we have an accumulation. This whitish zone has a lot of mineral nutrients, and then we've got an A horizon and an organic layer as well. So the result is, we'll just finish up briefly here on soils, with these patterns of precipitation that we saw in the previous lecture. We've got lots of rainfall on the coast. We've got a lot of rainfall in our southeast and in tropical zones. Combine that with patterns of temperature, and this is average July temperatures of, of course, cold in the north, warmer in the south, patterns of precipitation and rainfall. We wind up with this pattern of different kinds of soils. And I include a little legend over here. You'll see in each one of these biomes, you'll see height of vegetation, you'll see sort of the relative depths of soil horizons, different kinds of soil horizons. You see B, P, AET, and B is the total plant biomass that's there at any one time. P is the production, is the amount that is produced annually, and then actual evapotranspiration and potential evapotranspiration is how much water is flowing through those trees or grasses or shrubs up into the atmosphere. The potential is really a measure of the climate. How hot and sunny is it? That would lead to a lot of evaporation if plants were actually transpiring all that. So actual is what's observed. Potential is really a reflection of climate. And I think there we'll stop because my computer's running out of juice, and I'm going to talk next in the next video about biotic interactions and a little bit more about disturbance.